Good evening, or morning, or afternoon, whenever you happen to be seeing this. I hope you all are well. My name is Christopher Huang, and I am the author of A Gentleman's Murder. But more importantly, I am, like you, a lifelong fan of the works of Dame Agatha Christie. I should say that Christie has had a profound influence on me and on my work. As a schoolboy growing up in Singapore, she was my window into the British world. The Singapore I knew was a former British colony that, despite its Asian majority population, still retained a great deal of British influence. Every Singaporean school child past primary school knows, or is expected to know, that Singapore was founded in 1819 by Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles under the auspices of the East India Company, and that Singapore remained British for over a century and a half afterwards. This influence survives in the way the people drive, the way they write, the way they run the country, the way they educate their children. And I can't speak for all Singaporeans, but for me, that sort of influence inspired a curiosity that was fed and satisfied by literature. When I discovered Agatha Christie and fell in love with her work, it was as much about the world she wrote in as it was about her intricate plotting. And I don't mean the fashions or the hairstyles or the architectural movements of the time. That's all window dressing. This was about the manners and the mores of her world, the way people thought and behaved, or how Christie had them think and behave in her stories. This was middle and upper middle class Britain, occasionally nipping at the heels of the lower aristocracy. It was highly respectable maiden aunts and faithful butlers and large country houses, affluent at first but deteriorating under financial pressure with each passing book. The country house of Styles Court, introduced in The Mysterious Affair at Styles, for instance, is a much grander edifice than when we see it again in Curtin, and there is probably another talk to be had simply focusing on the country house as presented over the course of Christie's writing career. That writing career extended up to her death in the 70s, but we're concerned right now with the first 2 decades, the years between the two world wars. This was the golden age of detective fiction, and for us modern readers, something out of that time would not be just about the puzzles, but about the I don't want to say the setting, because that implies being limited to just the time and place with no room for anything beyond that. The world, let's say. Something that is shaped as much by the attitudes and thoughts of the people living within it as it is by mere window dressing. And detective fiction is about that world being threatened by the intrusion of murder and the efforts being taken to rectify the situation. We care about the story and the puzzle because we care about the world that has been presented to us, and we care about that world because it is familiar. It is very similar to the world that we actually value in real life. And there are many reasons for Christie's continued popularity, but I firmly believe that one of those reasons is her ability to present a world that feels like home, even to a Chinese teenager half a world away and more than half a century later. So let's back up a bit here. Let's step away from the world that Christie presented and look at the world that we know she lived in. We know that Christie's career began just as the First World War ended. We know that she was a volunteer nurse working in a dispensary. It follows that she had to be intimately familiar with the cost of the war in the form of wounded soldiers being shipped home for treatment. Her world was that of post-World War I England, a world coming back from 4 years of devastation. And we have the raw data to tell us what that all meant. We know the cost of the war in terms of lives lost. The United Kingdom lost between 7 and 800,000 men to combat, averaging about 500 a day and representing about 2% of the total population. Including non-combat and civilian deaths directly caused by the war, we're closer to 1 million men dead. And this was just the United Kingdom. Worldwide, the total death toll was about 10 million. And now, we've established that Christie knew the war as a volunteer nurse, and we're saying that one of her talents as a writer was in bringing the familiar home to her readers. The impact of the war was such that it had to be one of those things that her readers would have found intimately familiar. So the question is, can we treat Christie's writing as artifact and see from it what life in the aftermath of the First World War was like? Well, ask a silly question. Of course we can. We begin, of course, with the mysterious affair at Styles, which marks the beginning of Christie's career and the end of the First World War. Almost on the first page, we get a glimpse of the economic situation when one character remarks that he's got a drop or two of petrol still owing to the Major's activities. If he had just said, "I've got a drop or two of petrol still," and left it at that, we would have assumed that he was simply running low and needed to stop somewhere and top up his tank. Adding in a reason for him having any petrol at all, instead of a reason for having so little, it implies without stating outright that petrol has become a rationed commodity. The empty tank is the norm, and the possession of even a drop of petrol is something extraordinary. Now, this is, of course, only a very minor detail. It's one of the lesser realities of the time. But we should take note of the way in which that information is conveyed to us. It's offhand, it's casual. It relies on the reader to recognize the situation that's been left unsaid, and it tells us modern readers just what a reader 100 years ago would have found familiar and known well enough to have taken for granted. In this story, we're also introduced to Poirot, who is, at this point, one of several Belgian refugees seeking asylum in England. And I don't mind saying that I would not have known that Belgian refugees were ever a concern during the First World War, if not for Christie casting her great detective as one. Admittedly, The Mysterious Affair at Styles is really more about life at the tail end of the war than life after the war. But without going much further, we already find that we're learning far more about the time than Christie herself ever intended, and we have an idea of the sort of clues we should be watching out for from here on. So moving on, and now definitely into the post-war world, we come to The Secret Adversary, with Tommy and Tuppence Beresford, Tommy Beresford and Tuppence Cowley, newly released from their wartime duties, running low on funds, and looking to reinvent themselves after a fruitless search for employment. The tone of the story itself is light and hopeful. We don't dwell on the cost of the war, but on what the new world has to offer. When Tommy and Tuppence first treat themselves to a fine meal after coming into some money, complete with a menu of all the wonderful dishes that they're looking forward to, one wonders if their gusto might be somewhat reflective of the relief felt by millions at the end of wartime privations. And if these two are emblematic of the new post-war world, I would say that this new world must be one of uncertainty, but an exciting uncertainty that could be played to one's advantage if one only had the courage to do so. As we move chronologically further away from the First World War, however, its costs and its impacts seem to matter less. In Sad Cyprus, we have an old lover killed in the war. In And Then There Were None, we have an army general accused of deliberately sending someone to his death during the war. These are all very obvious plot points, though. They say very little about what life in that time was really like. They are things that we would not be surprised to see wherever there's been any war at all, and require no special insight. But then we come to the ABC Murders, published in 1936. This is the book that deals the most directly with the issue of shell shock and the rise of post-traumatic stress in the public consciousness. So let's take a moment to consider the actual facts surrounding shell shock and PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. The First World War saw the emergence of shell shock as a psychological phenomenon, paving the way for studies into war-related trauma. It's not that such psychological damage never happened before, or that absolutely nobody knew about it. But shell shock was more severe and at that time more widespread than ever before. If only a few people knew before, now everybody did. It was visible. It gave visibility to the whole concept of psychological war trauma. One might say that whatever else might have been done before this time, our study and understanding of post-traumatic stress really began with the First World War. Which means, of course, that everybody knew it was there, but nobody understood what it was. People initially thought that shell shock specifically was caused by exposure to artillery shelling and required a physical component, a head injury. To be thus affected was to be weak or cowardly, and there persisted a belief that good men did not succumb to shell shock. 346 men were executed over the course of the war for desertion or cowardice, and it is almost certain that most of these men, if not all of them, would be diagnosed with PTSD today. For the ordinary person waiting at home, they only knew that some men went off to war and came home different. One interesting statistic to take note of is that officers were 5 times more likely to be warded for shell shock. It's likely that any trauma they suffered was exacerbated by the requirement to bottle it up, to maintain a stiff upper lip and be an example to their men. Alternatively, it may be that officers were afforded better care and the ordinary rank and file was more likely to go undiagnosed. I believe the truth lies somewhere in between. Whatever the case, it means that shell shock was more visible among officers. If you went into war as an officer, it's likely that you came out of the middle or upper middle classes, or higher. So if something was more visible among the officers, it follows that it was more visible among the social classes that those officers came from. And these were the same social classes that Christie wrote about. She wrote about them because she knew them. Her own brother Monty came back from the war, well, maybe not shell-shocked exactly, but certainly unstable. So, getting back to the ABC murders now. Very early on in the book, in chapter 2, we're introduced to a character by the name of Alexander Bonaparte Cust. He's described as a shabby, ineffectual, and unobtrusive man, stoops, wears glasses, not the sort of man you'd notice. He suffered a head injury in the war and has had to deal with chronic headaches ever since. He's also had trouble holding down a job because of this, but has recently begun selling stockings door to door. This does not appear to be a unique situation. Another character in the novel says, and I quote, "Just one of those men who come around selling stockings. You know, ex-army people. They're very persistent." A page later, another character adds, "She said something about being sorry for these wretched men who go round and try to get orders." You know, ex-army people. Much like the drop or two of petrol casually mentioned in The Mysterious Affair at Styles, this relies on reader familiarity, and in so doing, it tells us what was familiar. It tells us that Cust's situation is ubiquitous. This is a world that includes scores of war veterans still trying to find their feet with occupation that is really more charity than anything else. There's no need to explain any further. Anyone reading the book at this time of publication, 1936, would be familiar with that sight. The simple reference to ex-army people paints a complete picture based on that familiarity, and everyone knows exactly what's going on. Now, 1936 is a full 18 years after the end of the war. In those 18 years, these scores of ex-army men have yet to find their feet, and their plight is still a matter of familiarity. As a side note, one wonders if Tommy Beresford might have ended up in the same situation if not for the Secret Adversary. Now, the other thing about Mr. Alexander Bonaparte Cust is that he's named and set up as the prime suspect as soon as we meet him, before any of the murders have even occurred. Rather than wonder who done it, we spend most of the book wondering when Poirot will discover his existence and confront him. It's not until chapter 16, halfway through the book, that we actually see him a second time. And I think it's safe to say that most of us at that point are pretty well convinced that he's the villain that we're after. Chapter 16, however, is where all those details about his character and war trauma come out, and they're presented as an explanation for the actions that we suspect him of. So let me read you a bit from that chapter. "You never know with lunatics," said the young man chattily. "They don't always look balmy, you know. Often they seem just the same as you or me." "I suppose they do," said Mr. Cust. "It's a fact. Sometimes it's the war what unhinged them, never been right since." Cust and the unnamed young man are discussing the newspaper headlines concerning the murders, and here we see something of the attitudes towards war trauma and post-traumatic stress at the time. At this point of the story, there's been no indication at all that shell shock or PTSD might lie at the heart of the murders, but this young man has already made the connection. If there is madness, it must be the war. Cust, meanwhile, is credible as a suspect because the general public is wary of the psychological effect of war trauma. To the average reader of the time, it is entirely plausible that Cust might have orchestrated a complex series of serial killings while in what we would today call a dissociative fugue state, a period in which he has blacked out and doesn't know what he is doing. Attitudes in 1936 seem to have changed somewhat from what was reported in 1918, where shell shock was once dismissed as a character weakness or a moral failing. It is now accepted as a reality but feared as a threat to the public safety. Now, Christie's exploration of post-traumatic stress as a price of war seems, at first glance, to be somewhat superficial. She does not explain it, nor does she discuss the ramifications, the studies, the treatments, nor does she pass judgment one way or another. The situation is simply there, existing in the background. But that's not the point of the novel. Christie's business is not to tell us that there is an elephant in the room, but to show us what life was like living around that elephant. As modern readers arriving in the room long after the elephant has left, we're more likely to believe in the elephant when we are shown the giant footprints in the carpet than when someone comes out and tells us directly to our face that the elephant was there. So, this supposedly superficial treatment, this reliance on familiarity to fill in the blanks, actually gives strength to the idea of post-traumatic stress being an inextricable aspect of life in post-World War I England. I'm sure there were some people who were lucky enough to have never seen it, but the impression one gets from Christie's appeal to familiarity is that there's always a friend of a friend with first-hand experience. Post-traumatic stress was a specter in the shadows, something everyone knew to be hovering in the background, ready to wreak havoc on a well-ordered world. It must be remembered as well that we tend not to explain the things that everyone knows. Everyone uses toothpaste, for example, but you're not likely to find a detailed explanation of toothpaste in a novel unless the poison was in it. Christie touches on these issues of the post-war world only lightly, but she gives us just enough context that we can understand what's going on. Through this combination of a light touch with just enough context, Christie includes us modern readers into the circle of those who know, and hypnotizes us into thinking that we know it too. Their familiarity becomes ours. As a modern reader, we have access to a host of collected information about the things that were actually there at the time. We pull out our phones and we hit Google, and a quick search will give us the numbers that I mentioned earlier, along with all the signs and symptoms we would care to know about for post-traumatic stress and shell shock. Living with these things, however, is a more subjective affair. Studies into war and its aftermath tend to dwell on the big issues, the death toll, the effects on the economy, the political shifts. They tend not to dwell on the small things like petrol consumption or the appearance of refugees in your back garden. They'll tell us that so many people were treated for shell shock, but they won't tell us just how it became a common wisdom that it was the war what unhinged them. But it is these little things that add up to the sum of life. Taking Christie's work as artifacts of their time, reading between the lines, we begin to pick up on these little things, and whether we realize it or not, we begin to understand the time in which they were written. Post-World War I Britain, with the likes of Tommy and Tuppence gorging themselves on newfound luxury after years of privation, with Alexander Bonaparte Cust trying and failing to get back into civilian life, with everyone wondering just when that ex-army man is going to snap. This world of deteriorating country houses and aged butlers and increasing numbers of maiden aunts because the war killed off their young men, this world begins to come alive. And I don't know about you, but this archaeological approach to come see how she lived, I strongly suspect that Christie would have approved. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Christopher Huang, and I bid you all a very good day or a good night whenever you happen to be seeing this.